Info Hub. In this special edition, we retrace the journey from slavery to present day. We also examine the contributions of the African to the Guyanese society. When the Dutch West Indian Company was founded in 1621, an estimated 900,000 slaves were brought to what was then British Guyana. These figures do not include those who died on the sea voyage and those who were killed by slave hunters in the gathering process on the African continent.
The slave trade became a very important part of the Dutch West Indian Company's activities. This was to support the rise of sugarcane production, which became a main crop in the early 1600s. The first ship bearing African slaves arrived in the Pomeroon in the mid-1600s.
We do know that most of the Africans who came to Guyana came from the West Coast. And if you were to go to Ghana, for example, and you were to look at the faces of people there, you'll believe you're looking at Guyanese faces. So Ghana, Nigeria, that West African part, perhaps all the way down to Angola.
By 1660, there were about 2,500 enslaved Africans in British Guyana. The Royal African Company was eventually established with the main purpose to supply slaves to the West Indies. Between the second half of the 17th century, the Dutch West Indian Company and the Royal African Company were deeply engaged in the slave trades.
If a village had 200 people, only 33 arrived in Guyana, because some were killed during the war, some were killed during the walk from the country, from the place they were to the ocean. 33% died, 10% died over the journey. And then when they came here, within 3 years, about 33% died. Those were the early days, because Guyana was the harshest country to civilize.
The enslaved Africans came via the transatlantic slave trade, and as the plantation system grew, so too did the slave population. Demerara Essequibo had a slave population of about 72,000 and Berbice about 21,000. These men and women had to endure long hours of arduous work, especially field slaves, insufficient clothing, poor housing, food which was deficient in both quantity and nutritional value, unsatisfactory medical attention, severe, often sadistic punishment, and for females, sexual exploitation. However, during the latter half of the 1700s, the slaves began to revolt against the cruelty they endured. The fight for their freedom began to take root in these revolts.
People struggled. And today, if you go to Georgetown, you'll see a monument to the people who died in 1823, August, this very month. They died on the east coast at a place called Bachelor's Adventure. 10,000 of them were marching down from the estates on the east coast to go to Georgetown to demand their freedom, and the British soldiers stopped them at Bachelor's Adventure. And on one morning on the 20th of August, 1823, killed 200 of them. 200 people were shot down at Bachelor's Adventure on the 20th of August, 1823. And this month we'll commemorate that massacre. And then again, if you go to Essequibo Coast, you'll see a monument at Regina, a monument to Damon, the leader of a revolt in 1834. After the 1st of August, 1834, the British told the Africans to go back on the plantations and work. And Damon said, "We are free. We will work for ourselves. We won't work for you." And he raised the flag at La Belle Alliance. And they arrested him, took him to Georgetown, and hung him. And today there's a monument commemorating that Essequibo revolt. And before that, in 1763, in February, Kofi started a rebellion up the Berbice River. And that rebellion is commemorated again, as you know, in a great monument, the 1763 monument in Georgetown. So the Demerara Revolt, the Essequibo Revolt, and the Berbice Revolt were all part of that emancipation struggle.
Across the Atlantic, too, the Europeans who once embraced slavery were now opposing it. The British Parliament outlawed the Atlantic slave trade in 1807, and in 1833 the Abolition Bill paved the way for emancipation on August 1, 1838, in British dominions.
That movement that culminated on the 1st of August, 1838. But that movement started a second movement, and that was the village movement, and that's why we have places like Ithaca. Because people, they were not tired of working, but they were tired of being beaten, as you saw in this beautiful skit. They're tired of being whipped and kicked. They're tired of being tortured. And they moved out of the plantations, not because they were lazy or they didn't want to work, but they did not want the degradation of the punishment that they received at the hands of the planter class.
When cotton plantations became unprofitable to the British in 1838, the freed Africans began to buy them up with the monies they had saved from working overtime. They continued to buy lands until 1852. By this time, more than 82,000 Africans worked on sugar estates and lived in their villages.
Formerly called Plantation Northbrook, Victoria was the very first village bought by slaves in November 1839. 83 ex-slaves from 5 nearby estates pooled their resources to purchase the plantation, which was renamed Victoria. Plantation Orange Nassa, located on the east coast of Demerara, was bought for $50,000 in 1840 and renamed Buxton. The community got its name from the British abolitionist Sir Thomas Buxton, who led the fight for the abolition of slavery.
One of the first things that the former slaves did was to provide land for church, because according to Guyana, they wanted to thank God for making them free. And so lands were allocated for church and school. School is because I don't think either one of them could have written or signed their names on the thing. So they wanted to ensure that that doesn't happen again. I'm not sure if it's not happening today, but they wanted to ensure that their descendants have access to schools.
The African struggle continued despite the village movement. The British, who now had to pay for labor, used devious means to force the Africans back to the sugar plantations when production began to drop. These means included flooding African villages with water from the estate canals. Coupled with this, the Africans lacked management experience and funds to maintain the villages, which led them to deteriorate. The enactment of improvement taxes on the properties of villagers in 1856 by the British Guyana legislature worsened the situation.
This system that you're talking about didn't just evolve. It came after a period of struggle with the colonial administration, because the villagers believed that these lands were bought and paid for by them, and therefore things like taxes and so on, they were not supposed to pay. There's a famous story of James Jupiter and 3 other members of Friendship who, when they were asked to pay taxes, decided that they were not going to pay. And when the administration decided to seize their properties, they decided that they were going to take a schooner and go all the way to England to the governor to make representation.
Against all these odds, the villagers still managed to build an economy. In fact, small businesses became part of the character of the village. Cake shops and bakeries, grocery stores, coconut and mattress factories were established.
The sister referred to the kind of industries, right? Once again, I want to refer to Fred Sigdio. He wrote in this document about how it's called Genesis of the Nation. I think it's either Genesis of the Nation 1 or 2, the Fred Sigdio document. But he referred to black people, and we could use Buxton as an example, being the pioneer for business in Guyana. And this includes going into the gold fields. He then asked the question, and this is in the 1970s, what has happened and why is it that there have not been a transition of those business? I'm mentioning that because the sister referred to it, right? We had all these baker shops at one time. Some people are saying 11, but I know we had 7 in the village. But we don't own a major bakery selling bread throughout the country and exporting other things we produce. That's a question we need to answer as we ponder the future of a community such as Buxton Friendship.
In 1938, a monument was erected on the 100th anniversary of the abolition of slavery to separate the farmlands from the housing areas. During that same period, the railway embankment was established, a development that allowed the villagers to sell their produce. Today, Buxton is known as one of the most established African settlements on the east coast of Demerara, with a population of close to 1,000 persons. The community has many established churches, 2 primary and nursery schools, a health centre, a secondary school, a practical instruction centre, water distribution systems, among other amenities. The Buxton community has significantly contributed to the preservation of the African culture in Guyana. Each year, this community organizes a week of activities to celebrate Emancipation Day, which is observed on August 1.
The freed Africans made significant contributions to the socio-economic structure of Guyana post-emancipation. But the systematic subordination of the African people by colonizers regressed these developments.
Many of the achievements of the freed Africans occurred during the village movement. Professor David Hines credited the movement to the development of Georgetown's coastlands.
Let me explain the significance of that. Prior to 1838, this coastland there in Guyana was the wild coast. It was a place where you brought people and you sold people and you killed people and you worked people to death, that you had no respect for humanity. What they did when they formed those villages is to humanize what we now call Guyana.
More importantly, the freed Africans recognized the importance of education and ensured schools and infrastructure facilities were constructed in their villages.
When they erected those schools, they were investing not in themselves only, they were investing in their children, in their future. You look at me today, you look at all African Guyanese descendants and other Guyanese who came later, and we owe it to them because they thought that education was important, and so they created schools.
The Africans also created a thriving economy, Professor Hines pointed out.
When they bought those lands, you got one house lot at the front of the village to build your homes, and then you got 2 house lots at the back to go and farm. And so what today we call the agriculture economy, the free agriculture economy, started in those villages. They created a political economy based on agriculture. What else did they do? They created their own government, what we today call the village councillors and the neighborhood councillors, to govern themselves. They elected their own chairperson and all of that, and created their own government. So here were people barely out of slavery, and were able to construct a political economy in this country that we today are standing on.
The Africans are also credited with developing an entrepreneurial culture in Guyana, as well as introducing the spirit of cooperatism. However, these achievements were sabotaged by the colonial rulers, who frustrated these efforts with the imposition of burdensome taxes and other legislative measures aimed at restricting economic activity in the villages.
As our people were frustrated from the land in the villages, many of them had to leave and come to town, come to the urban center to look for jobs and to feed their families.
These structural challenges, as Professor Hines referred to them, slowed the development of the once thriving villages. Added to that, many Africans lacked the experience and finances to upkeep their villages.
But there were also challenges that African people have to take responsibility for, that we have not always passed on to new generations. The spirit of entrepreneurship that you asked me about, the spirit of cooperativism, the spirit of African pride and dignity. We have not always passed that on. You see, people thrive on being part of something glorious.
Redressing the damage to the systemic subordination of African villages some that are still visible today, has begun.
That prejudice has not been erased. And that is why the United Nations passed this declaration, the International Decade for People of African Descent. And we in Guyana must try to fulfill those goals. Because unless we work towards the fulfillment of those goals between now and 2024, 31st of December, we will not be able to achieve full emancipation. Emancipation is not something that happened 178 years ago. Emancipation is continuous. You have to continue working to keep yourself from being enslaved. Keep yourself free. Keep yourself focused on the objectives of your forefathers, building a strong nation.
During slavery, many Africans were forced to give up their different cultures. While most of their cultural traditions have been lost to history, those that remain are distinct and infused into the wider Guyanese culture.
The African cultural influence can be found in the way the Afro-Guyanese dress. This is mostly visible at emancipation time and on ceremonial occasions, since the African dress is not the typical day-to-day attire. Popular clothing choices like the agbala, the dashiki, including female skirt and head wraps, are commonly worn in popular African prints.
What I'm trying to do here is to give her a head wrap that will go with her outfit and that will say celebrations.
Is perhaps the most common and easily identified African cultural presence. African influence like ground provision, plantain and flour can be found in typical Guyanese food known as Creole cuisine. Perhaps the deepest presence of the African culture can be found in our language. There are several words and phrases we use today that are of African origin. Common Guyanese terms such as eye water, bottom house, she run fast and it too sweetie. The African presence is also manifested in the performing arts. Guyanese folk songs like Itaname and folk tales like Anansi are excellent examples. Itaname itself originated from former slaves in Buxton in the 1950s.
I can give you a part of Buxton history where 7 brothers drowned one time. The falls was named Moora Falls. They named the rest of the family in village, the nephew that was left, they called him Moora, because he lost his uncles and his father at Moora Falls, right? But that was in the days when people were living here in groups and paddling past the falls. Today we have big outboard motors pushing you up those rapids, right? And that's how you got going to history and culture again. One man in the captain wake, Captain wakey, wakey, boatman. Boatman wakey, wakey, bowman. Bowman wake with the paddle in the hand. All I want is a long and strong and too much for me. Long and strong, Itaname, oh. Right, because now they are going to attempt to cross the Itaname waterfall by paddling.
Kwekwe is also another excellent example of the manifestation of the African presence in the performing arts. Singing and dancing to Kwekwe songs is an important part of African Guyanese pre-wedding celebrations. Other features of powerful Africanism in Guyanese society have survived in the form of religious practices that includes the elements of dance, drums, hand clapping, and in severe instances, possession and sacrifice. The libation ceremony is an example of African religious practice that has survived in today's Guyanese society. Ancestral worship is rooted in the African belief system. Worshippers appeal to gods and the spirits of ancestors for their healing, salvation, spiritual cleansing, and good fortune.
The libation is a pour drink offering And so we're giving respect to our ancestors so that they can always be with us. They can be able to bless us with a good ashe, good energy, good guidance, good direction. Never mind, some people say that the dead can't talk and the dead can't this, but the dead can. Of course the dead can do those things, but our ancestors are not dead. Somebody?
One of the purest forms of African religious survival in Guyana is the Comfa. This is where spirit possession by devotees is germane to the achievement of goals. There are also other minor practices in which spirits of the water, air, or earth are appealed to. These are all parts of the cultural heritage of emancipation. They originated in slavery and became more pervasive in post-emancipation societies. What is of great importance is that this cultural heritage has been localized and creolized in Guyana and is part of the national culture.
Emancipation Day is celebrated by way of cultural activities, which include drumming, singing, dancing, and a vast array of African dishes.
Most of the festivities are organized by the African Cultural and Development Organization, ACDA, and the Coffee 250 group with the common goal of promoting African culture. This year, ACDA's emancipation theme is Moving Forward, Building Guyana Through Ujamaa, Cooperative Economics. ACDA also highlights a country from Africa as part of the festival. This year, that country is the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The DRC is being celebrated because it is the second largest country in Africa with a very rich history and culture. The organization is also highlighting the glorious history of Union, village number 53 on the Corentyne River, Berbice.
We chose Union because we chose the Congo, the linkage. Both the people of the village of Union, number 53 village, state that they're Congolese, and so we try to do that link.
The national park is the main gathering point on Emancipation Day. Every August 1st, this venue comes alive as thousands of Guyanese from all walks of life, decked out in their colorful African prints, gather to participate in ACDA's Emancipation Day Festival. The fun-filled African festival features some of the best local and international acts, African food, folk games, drumming, dancing, and singing. Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu said the day epitomizes Guyana's cultural heritage.
Splendorous outbursts of joy, of happiness, of contentment. Of course, we have problems in Guyana, like so many other countries, but I didn't see that taking preeminence. I see people want to assert themselves, and the heritage and cultural traditions are things that we need to project, so that if we want to weld ourselves as a nation with several ethnicities, we'll have to start to buy in from all the traits and all the strands of this cultural tradition to produce really the Guyanese culture, the Guyanese personality.
This year, Guyana is celebrating 179 years of emancipation. For many Guyanese, this observation is not only a moment of celebration, but also a time of deep reflection.
Today is a day of determination, a day when your foreparents decided to leave the plantations and to construct a nation. They moved Guyana from a plantation to a nation. Today is the day of departure, a day of departure from degradation, from discrimination, from servitude. And that is why so often you will hear on a day like today the invocation in the Holy Bible, "This is the day that the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the Lord's day."
The boldness of Kofi, the fortitude of Accra, and the moral fierceness of Damon must illuminate our path as we tread the road the full emancipation of all Guyanese. Today, we are the beneficiaries of the legacy of their sacrifice, struggle, and ultimate victory for justice. Or is it beautifully, as it is captured in the national anthem, we are born of their sacrifice, heroes of their pains.
There is, of course, much to celebrate. For everyone, today marks the overcoming of the most inhumane system in human history. Emancipation Day celebration recognizes the hardship the slaves, or forefathers, experienced, the very overcoming of slavery and the many slave rebellions and other forms of resistance that are testimony to this. That emancipation meant freedom from slavery. The role of the descendants of slaves played in helping to craft a humane society.
And finally, some scenes of President David Granger and Prime Minister Moses Nagamootoo at various Emancipation Day activities. We hope you've had a safe and enjoyable Emancipation Day. Thanks for watching. Connect with us 24/7 on our website and social media.